What I think for my brother, this is something he's been waiting for, and he's probably spent more time thinking about it. The air turned still. One breath, one message, and Prince William was visibly shaken. It wasn't grief. It was something far deeper. It was supposed to be a private meeting, a moment of quiet reflection among the highest members of the royal family, gathered to hear King Charles's final wishes. There were no cameras, no advisors, no distractions, only silence, anticipation, and the weight of legacy hanging heavy in the room. Princess Anne stood in the center, clutching a letter that looked worn by time but etched with clarity. She wasn't emotional, but her posture was resolute. The moment she unfolded the page and began to speak, the energy shifted. What was expected was a standard address, a transition of responsibility, perhaps a nod to continuity, a reaffirmation that William, the heir, would carry on the legacy Charles had spent his life preparing for. Instead, what followed dismantled that expectation in a heartbeat. Anne's voice was calm, yet her words ignited tension. Every syllable unraveled decades of assumptions. As the letter went on, William's expression changed. His jaw clenched, his eyes clouded. He leaned forward, hands gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping him grounded. Then came the sentence that splintered everything. The letter did not begin with a blessing for William's reign. It did not speak of his character, his preparation, or his future as king. It spoke of someone else, someone whose name wasn't expected to take center stage. Catherine, the words were clear. She must lead when I no longer can. For a moment, William blinked like he hadn't heard it right. Then, in a flash of realization, his shoulders dropped, and he slumped back into his seat, as if the air had been punched out of him. His face, usually controlled and measured, betrayed a man crushed under the weight of a legacy that had just slipped sideways. This wasn't a power grab, it wasn't an insult, it was a redirection of fate. The others in the room said nothing. They didn't have to. What could be said when the future of the crown was being rewritten before their eyes, not in fury or rebellion, but in calm, deliberate ink from a dying king's hand? One sat in silence, her eyes lowered, her hands folded. She had no reaction, no tears, but her presence was a quiet force, one that had clearly been seen, understood, and chosen. William wasn't furious, he wasn't jealous. What he felt was something even more haunting. Displacement? For all the years of training, all the weight he had carried, he had not been prepared for this. What message could be so powerful that the future king nearly broke in front of his family? He spent his entire life waiting for the crown, but the crown barely stayed with him. In those final months, King Charles knew time was running out. When Queen Elizabeth II passed in September 2022, the world mourned, and the United Kingdom shifted. For over 70 years, she had been the anchor of the monarchy, constant, unshaken, revered. Charles had waited longer than any heir in British history to assume the throne. And yet, when the moment came, it was not triumph he felt. It was something else, something colder. He had trained his entire life for this role, yet it seemed that destiny had other plans. The crown, which he had envisioned as a culmination, quickly became a burden, one that pressed heavier with each passing day. As the dust of ceremony settled and royal duties multiplied, a silent storm was forming inside the king's body. The palace first described it as an enlarged prostate, a seemingly manageable condition, but the truth was far more devastating. Behind those closed doors, Charles was quietly diagnosed with cancer in early 2020. At first, he tried to carry on. The public, unaware of the true gravity, continued to see their new monarch attend events, give speeches, and wave from balconies. But behind every photograph was a man fading, his movements slower, his eyes dimmer, his once commanding presence shrinking under the weight of illness. Those who knew him well noticed immediately. His suits hung looser, his voice occasionally trembled, and his once fiery energy dulled to a distant flicker. The image of a monarch was being held up by duty alone. Behind palace walls, reality was unavoidable. Charles couldn't keep up, and quietly, the monarchy began to shift, without fanfare or announcement. Duties were quietly redistributed. Princess Anne, known for her tireless commitment and sharp instincts, became the silent engine keeping engagements alive. She was everywhere cutting ribbons, shaking hands, honoring charities. She didn't speak about it. She simply did what needed to be done. William, too, stepped forward, his schedule thickening with appearances, responsibilities, and symbolic roles. But it wasn't just about delegation. It was about contingency. Charles was no longer thinking about reign. He was thinking about succession, survival, and legacy. He knew the monarchy couldn't appear weakened, not after years of scandal and public scrutiny. He knew the line between duty and collapse was razor thin. What few realized was that Charles had started asking a new question. Not just who would take his place, but who could preserve what the crown still meant. He looked to his family not just for bloodlines, but for conviction. He saw the turbulence surrounding his sons, the damage inflicted by personal choices, and the instability threatening the institution he had waited so long to lead. Charles didn't have the time to reinvent the monarchy, but in his quiet reflection, he could choose the one person he believed could carry its soul forward. And that choice was already taking shape in his mind. And it was in these silent months that Charles made a decision no one expected. She never wanted the spotlight, but the crown trusted her with its most sacred secret, and she delivered it with grace that pierced the silence. Princess Anne had always been the monarchy's quiet force. She wasn't glamorous, wasn't dramatic, and never chased public praise. For decades, she worked behind the scenes, unwavering, consistent, and devoted. In a family often defined by scandal and spectacle, Anne remained untouched. She didn't play palace politics, didn't make headlines for controversy, and never used her title as a weapon. She was, simply put, reliable, and King Charles knew that when his time ran short, it would take more than ceremony to secure the monarchy's soul. It would take truth. So when he penned his final personal message, it wasn't Camilla he turned to. It wasn't William, it was Anne. Charles had watched his sister for years with quiet admiration. Where others faltered, she endured. Where others sought attention, she chose service. By 2024, as his illness became more apparent behind palace walls, Anne's presence became more visible. She took on more public engagements, often in place of the king. Yet she never asked why. She simply did what was needed, embodying the stoicism that their mother, Queen Elizabeth II, had once been known for. But it wasn't just duty, it was trust. Charles understood that the message he needed to leave behind wasn't for the media, nor even for history books. It was for the family, a message about the future of the crown. And only one person could be counted on to deliver it without distortion, ego, or ambition. In the days leading up to the private gathering at the palace, Anne kept the letter close. She didn't reveal what it said. She didn't discuss it with her children, with courtiers, or even with Camilla. She knew this wasn't a matter of protocol, it was a matter of legacy. And when the moment arrived, she entered the room, not as a royal, but as a witness, one chosen by the king himself. Her calm was unsettling. Her voice was steady. There was no ceremony, no dramatics. She began to read. Every person in that room knew the importance of what was happening, but Anne never looked for their approval or reaction. She didn't inject herself into the message. She simply delivered the words as Charles had written them. The weight of the room shifted with every sentence. She spoke not with emotion, but with purpose. There was no hesitation, no trembling. And that was what made the moment feel even more monumental. Anne had become the monarchy's unflinching truth-bearer. She had carried the crown's secret, not out of obligation, but out of love for her brother, for the institution, and for the future. Her loyalty had never been in question, but now her role was cemented in history. Because when her voice rang out, it wasn't William's name that echoed, it was Catherine's. It was never about power, it was about presence. And when her name was spoken, the future bent quietly toward her. The room, already tense with anticipation, tilted on its axis the moment Princess Anne uttered the words, "Let her lead when I no longer can." It was not a command, it was a confession. A king, aware of his own frailty, laying bare the truth he had come to accept too late, that the survival of the monarchy might not rest on its heir, but on its anchor. And that anchor was not William, it was Catherine. The message struck with the force of prophecy, quiet, deliberate, and irreversible. For those who had expected affirmation of the traditional line of succession, it was a moment of stunned silence. For William, it was something else entirely. He didn't lash out. There was no protest, no bitterness. His body did the speaking, his head lowered, his hands clenched. Not in anger, but in recognition. This was not a betrayal, it was a reckoning. He had spent a lifetime preparing to follow in his father's footsteps, only to discover that the map had changed, and the compass no longer pointed to him alone. What Charles had written wasn't an erasure of William's role. It was a redefinition of what leadership meant in this new era. It wasn't about heritage anymore. It was about heart, strength, endurance, and Catherine had proven all of that in silence. He didn't flinch. She didn't shift in her seat. Her composure was not cold. It was complete. As the weight of the room bore down on William, Catherine reached for him. A simple gesture, her hand on his. But in that single moment, it was clear. She wasn't just beside him, she was holding him together. She was his stillness in the storm. Just as she had been through every royal crisis, every scandal, every brutal tabloid headline. She didn't have to assert herself. She had already been chosen not by politics, not by favoritism, but by her unwavering consistency when everything else faltered. And suddenly, the meaning of Charles's words crystallized for everyone present. The future wasn't about who had the oldest claim. It was about who had already proven capable of carrying the institution when others could not. Legacy was no longer a matter of lineage, it was a matter of presence, and Catherine had shown time and again that she didn't just support the crown, she embodied its essence. The message delivered by Anne didn't dismantle the royal hierarchy. It restructured its foundation, subtly but powerfully, around a woman who had never asked for the throne, but had been quietly preparing for it all along. To understand why Charles made this choice, we have to understand Catherine's silent rise. She wasn't born royal, but with every step, every decision, she proved herself more than worthy of the crown. Catherine Elizabeth Middleton came into the world far from palaces and pageantry. Born in the English countryside of Berkshire, her childhood was simple, structured, and deeply rooted in values that shaped her quietly formidable character. Her parents, Michael and Carol, were self-made people who built a life of comfort and stability through hard work, not titles. From them, Catherine learned the importance of composure without arrogance, strength without dominance, and grace without expectation. There were no silver spoons, no royal tutors, no press, tracking her every move, just discipline, humility, and a steady belief that one's worth is proven, not proclaimed. When she stepped onto the campus of St. Andrew's University, she was just another student, ambitious, polite, and quietly focused. But fate had other plans. That was where she met Prince William. And while the world would come to obsess over their courtship, what few understood was how carefully Catherine navigated the storm that followed. The media obsession was relentless. She was dissected in headlines, her every outfit analyzed, her silence mistaken for weakness. But she didn't retaliate, she didn't chase interviews or craft a public persona. Instead, she stood her ground, not by fighting back, but by staying true to herself. She wasn't chasing a prince, she was building a life, and he just happened to be in it. Their relationship endured years of scrutiny and breakups, but Catherine remained consistent. She didn't transform herself to fit into the royal mold. Instead, the mold quietly reshaped itself around her. And when William proposed in 2010, giving her the ring once worn by Princess Diana, it was more than a romantic gesture. It was a symbolic merging of legacies, past grief with future promise. Their wedding in 2011 wasn't just a royal spectacle, it was a global moment of transition. The girl from Berkshire became Her Royal Highness, the Duchess of Cambridge. But even as her title changed, her demeanor did not. Catherine never sought to dazzle. She didn't trade humility for prestige. Instead, she let her actions, not her crown, speak for her. Over the next decade, through pregnancies, public scrutiny, and palace protocol, she proved herself again and again, not by grand statements, but by showing up, with quiet poise and relentless reliability. She represented the monarchy in hospitals, schools, and war memorials. She never stumbled, never overreached, never asked for more than what she had earned. In a world of noise, she chose stillness. And in that stillness, she became the very symbol of stability, the royal family so desperately needed. But it wasn't just her past that Charles recognized, it was what Catherine was already doing behind the scenes. A brittle envelope, a handwritten letter. Not instructions, but prophecy. Queen Elizabeth saw it before anyone else. As the shock of King Charles's message still echoed through the room, Princess Anne, steady and composed, reached into the inside pocket of her coat and produced something even more unexpected. It wasn't part of the formal proceedings, it wasn't mentioned in any official records, but it had been kept deliberately, delicately, for this precise moment. The paper, aged and creased, bore no royal seal. It was not addressed to the Privy Council or meant for public disclosure. This was personal, a final word from the Queen, who had reigned longer than anyone in British history. And it was meant for Anne alone. Queen Elizabeth had seen the monarchy change, fracture, and bend under pressure. She had witnessed scandal, rebellion, loss, and the crumbling of public trust. Yet through it all, she remained unshaken. But in her final years, even she knew that legacy couldn't be preserved by bloodline alone. That required vision. And what she saw in Catherine was not just a supportive spouse, but a force of silent strength. Her words, as Anne began to read them aloud, were not grand or flowery. They were simple, direct, honest. She carries the mind and heart of a true monarch, the Queen had written. There was no ambiguity. The praise was specific. Catherine's instinct, her measured resolve, her ability to lead without demanding the crown. Elizabeth had watched her grow, not in the spotlight, but through how she carried herself when no one was supposed to notice. She saw how Catherine bore pressure, how she shielded her children, how she walked through fire without ever letting it consume her. In the Queen's eyes, Catherine didn't need a crown to hold power. She held it already simply by being present, thoughtful, unwavering. The letter kept secret until now was never meant to challenge William's position, but its timing, its tone, and its content revealed something undeniable. Elizabeth had foreseen the turbulence to come, and she had placed her quiet confidence not in tradition, but in someone who could redefine it without destroying it. By entrusting this message to Anne, the Queen had ensured that her voice would reach beyond her death, without interference, without distortion. She hadn't declared Catherine a ruler. She had declared her essential. Now, for the first time, the family realized that Catherine wasn't only carrying the weight of Charles' confidence, but Elizabeth's too. Two monarchs, shaped by entirely different eras, had looked into the future and seen the same truth, that sometimes the crown's survival depended not on who inherited it, but on who upheld its spirit when everything else was falling apart. The room grew still again, not out of shock this time, but revelation. Because if two monarchs saw Catherine as the crown's future, where does that leave William? He prepared his whole life for the crown. But in that moment, it felt further away than ever. Prince William had been raised with one destiny, to one day become king. From childhood, the title future monarch was stitched into every corner of his life, every handshake, every photograph, every carefully scripted moment. But no amount of training could have prepared him for this. Not for the moment when both his father and grandmother, sovereigns in their own right, quietly cast their faith not solely on him, but on his wife. There was no betrayal in their message, but there was something far more unsettling doubt. And it wasn't their doubt that haunted him. It was his own. Inside, William was unraveling, not with anger, not with resentment, but with a quiet war waging between duty and love, between legacy and transformation. He had always known Catherine was remarkable, but knowing it in private and watching the crown bend toward her in public were two entirely different things. He was not jealous, he was terrified. Not of losing his place in the line, but of being part of a monarchy that was shifting beneath his feet, one that might demand a kind of leadership he hadn't been born to give. His mind returned to every fracture he had endured. The fallout with Harry, once his closest ally, had left scars, not just on the brothers, but on the very institution they were raised to protect. The public exit, the interviews, the accusations they had stripped the crown of its armor and exposed it to a generation that demanded more than ceremony. And then came Andrew, a scandal so deep and shameful, it cast a shadow that not even 1,000 years of tradition could cover. Through it all, William had stayed. He had endured, but he hadn't healed. Now, with the monarchy facing its most fragile moment, he saw the truth that everyone else had quietly accepted. Catherine wasn't simply part of the royal family. She had become its lifeline. While he wrestled with tradition, she embodied evolution. While he carried the past, she pulled in the future. The public didn't just admire her, they trusted her. They looked at her and saw calm in chaos, strength in silence, and that trust, earned slowly and without spectacle, was now the foundation the monarchy was standing on. William wasn't blind to any of it, but he was lost in it, torn between the honor of his birthright and the possibility that the crown might no longer move forward in the way he had always imagined. For the first time in his life, the question wasn't if he could lead, but if he should lead alone. And in that quiet uncertainty, one thing remained painfully clear. The woman beside him, once merely his partner, was now the anchor holding the entire monarchy together. And just as the world began to understand her strength, she faced her most personal battle yet. One video, one bench, one truth that made the entire world pause. It was March 2025 when the silence broke. After months of speculation, blurry photographs, and whispered rumors swirling across the media landscape, Catherine, the Princess of Wales, appeared in a short, deeply personal video. Right on a simple bench, stripped of royal formality, she addressed the nation. Her voice, calm but slightly strained, carried a truth no one wanted to hear. She had been diagnosed with cancer. It wasn't a dramatic reveal. There was no carefully orchestrated press conference, just honesty, measured but raw. And in that moment, the future queen consort became something far greater than a symbol of royalty. She became a reflection of the people she served. The world stopped. The woman who had held so much together, her family, the monarchy, the fragile confidence of a watching public, was now fighting a battle that no crown could shield her from. Yet even in illness, she remained composed. There were no theatrics, no pleas for sympathy, just clarity. She explained that the cancer had been discovered during a surgery, that she was undergoing preventative chemotherapy, that she needed time, but she was hopeful. It wasn't just the message that resonated, it was the way she delivered it with dignity, vulnerability, and a strength that echoed far louder than any title ever could. William, often measured and reserved, stepped back from public life without hesitation. Duties could wait. Appearances could be cancelled. His priority, for the first time in decades, was not the throne, but the woman who had always stood beside him, unwavering. Those closest to the family said it was the most emotionally open they had ever seen him. And for once, the nation didn't expect their future king to perform. They understood, because through Catherine's voice, they saw themselves a mother, a wife, a daughter, quietly enduring something millions around the world have faced. But what made her story even more profound was that she never truly stopped working. Even as she stepped back from public engagements, her teams continued pushing forward the causes she had championed for years. Early childhood development, mental health awareness, the quiet, unglamorous initiatives that rarely made headlines but changed lives. Staffers revealed that Catherine stayed involved, reading updates, signing off on decisions, even from treatment. It wasn't about duty anymore, it was about devotion. This was not the image of royalty the palace had spent generations preserving. This was something better. This was real. And in that quiet, candid moment, Charles's decision and Elizabeth's foresight were both vindicated. They hadn't placed their trust in Catherine because of protocol or appearance. They had seen something the public was now finally beginning to understand. An inner strength that didn't shout but endured. A heart that didn't just serve the crown, but carried it. She wasn't just the face of the monarchy. She was its humanity. And in the background, one woman ensured none of this was lost in silence, Princess Anne. No trumpets, no balcony wave, just two women reshaping the monarchy without needing a throne. While the world focused on William's silence and Catherine's resilience, something even more profound was happening behind palace walls. A subtle but undeniable shift in royal power. It wasn't loud, it wasn't formal, but those watching closely could feel it. Princess Anne, the tireless royal workhorse, and Catherine, the quiet cornerstone of the modern crown, were appearing together more frequently. Publicly, it seemed like nothing more than joint engagements, shared causes, or coordinated forces. But privately, insiders knew the truth. This was a mentorship, a passing of institutional wisdom, a preparation not for power, but for permanence. Anne had always been the monarchy's steady hand, disciplined, discreet, allergic to drama. For decades, she carried out more engagements than almost anyone else in the family, never asking for recognition. She was the embodiment of duty, and she saw that same spirit reflected in Catherine. The two women shared a bond that didn't need words. It was built on action. Where others in the family had faltered, they stepped in. Where others ran from scrutiny, they stood still. They didn't complain. They didn't scheme. They simply endured. And in that endurance, a revolution was born. Not loud, not immediate, but deliberate and undeniable. Behind closed doors, it became clear that Anne wasn't just supporting Catherine. She was shaping her. Not in the mold of Elizabeth or even Diana, but into something new. A sovereign figure without ceremony, a leader without proclamation, one who understood the burden of the crown without ever chasing its glow. Anne, by choice and by character, had never sought the throne, but she understood what it took to keep it standing. And as Catherine faced personal battles and rising public expectations, Anne became the one voice she could trust, the one example she could follow without fear of failure. Palisades confirmed what the public was already sensing. Catherine wasn't just admired anymore, she was trusted. Across Britain and the Commonwealth, approval ratings soared. Mothers saw strength, survivors saw courage. Citizens, once skeptical of monarchy's relevance, began to see something human in her presence. The emotional core of the monarchy had shifted not toward tradition or bloodline, but toward sincerity and compassion. In Catherine, people didn't just see a royal, they saw a reflection of who the crown could be. And in Anne, they saw the steady hand making sure that transformation didn't collapse under the weight of history. Together, they redefined what royal power looked like, not with crowns or commands, but with endurance, with empathy, with integrity. The monarchy wasn't being rescued. It was being reimagined quietly, steadily, intentionally, not by the men who inherited it, but by the women who sustained it when the world stopped believing. The crown is no longer passed with ceremony, but through trust, presence, and a promise. Catherine is that promise. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.